I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we have an ancient tradition here at the Chinese Literature Podcast dating back the year 2020. That is right. It is ancient. We do one podcast every year at the end of the year. I think this is going to actually be broadcast in the beginning of the year, which is appropriate, of doing a podcast where we don't talk about literature so much, but just kind of give updates on where we are personally. Sometimes listeners ask about that, and so we like to kind of update people on where things are at. This year, it is particularly relevant.
It is particularly relevant. This is sort of an end of the year, end of something, and beginning of something new. So,
end of the era podcast.
End of an era. So I do actually have a fairly big announcement.
And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love.
Wow. That was not the announcement I was going to make. And also, we probably just lost like 1,000 subscribers just there. They just dropped us.
And we're probably getting sued by Michael Jackson's estate.
I can't. Wouldn't that be amazing? That would be amazing if that's like the podcast crumbled because Michael Jackson sued us. I think that would be incredible. But I do actually have an announcement, and that is that starting, effectively after this podcast, I will no longer be a regular contributor to the podcast. So, Lee, you will be carrying forward the Good Podcast name, sometimes solo, sometimes with invited guests. I will pop up here and there for a guest episode or two, possibly even a guest series, time permitting.
We were hoping to do a guest series on the 80s with you.
That would be fun. That would be fun sometime in the future, yeah. But now, the listeners won't know this, Lee, but, I actually this is the first time you and I have sat down to podcast in like 3 months, something like that?
Something. I mean, it actually probably was, 3 months, because maybe longer than that.
Maybe longer.
Because, so we're actually recording this in late November, on the cusp of December.
Right.
It was probably in August, early August, or mid-August, because my daughter was born in mid-September. I guess that's another announcement I have to make. I now have another daughter.
Yours is definitely bigger than mine.
I don't know. The podcast is maybe more important than any one individual, right?
Wow. That's. I don't know if that's deep or disturbing, and I don't really know what the line is between those two things.
It's both.
Fair enough. So yes, but we kind of binge recorded a bunch in August, and then I did a bunch of stuff here career-wise, and then now I'm jumping back on for this end of the year, end of the podcast, sort of podcast?
End of the era podcast.
End of the era podcast.
You mentioned you did a bunch of stuff for your career. Could you tell listeners about like where you're at? Because you said here, and I don't know if everybody knows where here is, or where you're going. Rob, what are you doing right now?
Well, right now, I have a bum foot and can't actually do a whole lot. But if I didn't have a bum foot, I would be a teacher here.
Here in
France, yes. Probably going to be in France for the long term. I don't see why we would leave. We're doing very well here. We like it here. They have great bread. I mean, why would you leave a place that makes amazing bread? That's kind of a...
And 500 varieties of cheese, right?
Exactly. Anyway, but... it's actually kind of an interesting segue out of the podcast topic, or maybe back into it. We'll see. But, Lee, you and I once, I think it was when I finished my PhD or you finished yours, we did a podcast on kind of like grad school in general, what stuff we wish we'd done differently and whatever else. And my big regret in grad school is I never did get a master's in education because I love to teach. One of the things I learned in grad school is I primarily like to teach. I like being in a classroom. I like interacting with students. I like thinking of how I'd present material so that they're interested in it. I realized I also really don't like research, or I don't like writing papers and writing books about my research. I just want to teach it. I want to be in a classroom with people talking about it. And so when I got out here, I spent a little time doing a translation because I wanted to see, like maybe I really like this translation gig. Maybe I can make a career out of this. I don't like the translation gig. At least not the stuff I was translating.
Before we get too far, can you tell folks what you were actually translating?
I was translating Wang Guowei's Notes on Ci Poetry from the Human World, so 人间词话. It's a really amazing work, but the way I chose to do it played to my weaknesses rather than my strengths.
How so?
Because there's a whole lot of classical Chinese. You and I had many, many hours of discussions about this, but if you're not proficient at classical Chinese and you're proposing to translate classical Chinese, you could be in some deep doo-doo, and I was several places.
Yeah, I mean, when you actually mentioned the project to me in 2021, because you got it in late 2020, 2021, right?
Yeah.
And it's through Oxford University Presses. Their
Shutong Library of Classical Chinese.
And you mentioned that to me, and I was like, man, I didn't realize Rob's classical was that good.
Thank God for colleagues, for great resources online, for chat groups and things like that. It's going to be a really good work. It was just unbelievably hard and not exactly what I want to spend my day doing. So I was like, at the end of that project, I was like, you know what I really miss? I miss human interaction and being in a classroom. So now I am going through the process of becoming a teacher here. I'm starting off kind of there's a way to become a teacher in France where you don't have to have a teaching license in the short term. So I will be teaching at a lycée, which is the French version of high school, teaching English, which is also a kind of a shift, although I've taught English a lot. Actually, I've taught more English than I have other things now that I think about it.
You won't be teaching English language. You'll be teaching like literature, right?
A little bit of everything. The French system here, they have end of high school exams, a little like in China. You have to kind of pick a path you're going to take.
The baccalaureate, right?
Yeah, the baccalaureate.
One of the many Napoleonic innovations.
There you go. It's a pretty rigorous system, but it's really kind of cool. I came in here thinking the French system was going to be kind of like Chinese, where it's like the teacher walks in, tells everyone how to speak the language, everyone repeats the lesson, and we move on. But it's a lot more dynamic and colorful, and they do tons of games and interactive stuff and lots of resources. It's pretty cool. I love to teach, and that's what I'm going to be doing, so it's cool.
So pedagogically, it's a bit more innovative than your experience of teaching in China. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, way more innovative. Way more innovative. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I mean, there's always little side projects and stuff, but that's me. Not in a nutshell. I almost said a nutshell, but that's all I have in my life. That's me in a nutshell.
You also have two boys who you're raising when you're not hobbling on your foot.
My busted foot. My game leg. There's a good one. And so you, my friend, are fairly busy as well.
Yeah, other than raising two daughters, I'm working on a book project, which we have talked about on and off throughout the podcast. I'm starting to send it off to agents. I've actually worked with someone in the publishing industry through a think tank that I have a connection with, and he helped me work on a book proposal. We have a listener who way back in 2020 very, very generously offered some help, and he has taken a look at the book proposal as well. I've gotten a lot of folks who've done some input on the project, and actually if folks here who are listening are in the publishing industry or have any experience, I'd love for them to reach out to me at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Send me an email. But yeah, so I'm starting the process of actually trying to get that published. Say book. I've changed the title, Rob, called China's Backstory, and it uses the kind of lens of the news and the most important stories in the American media about China, and tries to do a deep dive into each of those topics. So Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, the Chinese economy. Looking at a variety of different topics and going, this is what the media says. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So that's what I've been working on for much of the last year.
And it's not like you had nothing to do anyway with having a new daughter in the house and everything. So
trying to get some sleep.
Yeah, trying to get some sleep occasionally. And as we mentioned earlier, you will be carrying the podcast forward. So
I did 3 episodes without you, just as kind of to experiment with how it worked. I'm hoping to improve on that as things go forward. I'll probably continue doing the bi-weekly episodes rather than weekly episodes, since before you did a lot of the initial editing. Now I'm doing all of the editing and the social media stuff. So it's just in terms of a time suck, I have to be careful if I'm going to take the book project seriously.
Yeah.
So I'll probably continue with the bi-weekly episodes. Maybe if I kind of feel confident, I'll scoot it over to a weekly episode. But right now, I'm leaning towards doing it just once every 2 weeks.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Otherwise, you have to dream up a heck of a lot of topics and then also edit them. Yeah, that's a huge time suck.
I mean, the way we've done the podcast is you and I would just, one of us would propose something and the other, as long as they were interested and it wasn't too much time, it would just be fine. And like there were episodes that really you carried completely, and there were episodes that I carried completely.
Right.
And you know,
Right.
the partner was just kind of sort of the peanut gallery, almost throwing out comments, but not really adding that much. I think not so much the more recent sci-fi episodes that we did, but like when we did Liu Cixin, that was entirely you. I didn't care for Liu Cixin.
Because there were weeks you could just go, you know what, I'm not feeling it this week. I'm just gonna let Lee say whatever like. If you want to talk about this, let's talk about this. I'm just gonna go, yeah, that sounds cool or whatever.
And it's interesting, as I've done these 3 episodes by myself, I've come to realize that a lot of what made our podcast really cool before was the sort of the like flint knocking against each other.
Yeah.
You and I were 2 very different flints, but we would create these sparks and just kind of run with them.
Yeah.
And with doing a single person episode, it's been much more planned and required a lot more thoughtful work. Whereas, you know, even when I wasn't just phoning it in, there was so much energy between you and me that I didn't really have to prepare that much. You would have something that you would see in the text and I would go, oh yeah, that's cool. Let's kind of chase that down a rabbit hole. And then I would have something, throw it out there, and you would kind of chase that down a different rabbit hole. And after 15 or 20 minutes, we had done a couple of rabbit holes and we had really covered the topic. But if it's just a one-person podcast, you really can't do that. You have to come with all of the info. There is no serendipity. It's all scripted, for me at least. So it's a very different experience.
When you talk about the Flint thing, one of the things that strikes me is that when we first started doing this, which by the way,
sorry, did you just say one of the things that strikes me after we made a Flint metaphor?
That was totally unintentional, but I mean, that's just the kind of genius I bring to the podcast. I don't even know I'm doing it, and it's happening. It's incredible. First of all, I don't know if listeners know this, but we started this podcast 7 years ago.
We started it was the weekend around the New Year in 2015. 2015, yeah. Because you and I had talked. I had lunch or dinner with you and your wife, and I was like, hey, do you want to do this literature podcast? And you were like, yeah, let's do it. And so about a month later, so I guess that happened right after school ended for the quarter. And then, you know, less than a month later, we did it.
Yeah.
We just kind of recorded on your laptop, I think, with your mic laptop.
No mic, nothing,
sound.
just a MacBook mic. It was rough.
And we didn't air a lot of those episodes. So we were kind of like building up a catalog. We didn't actually start publishing the podcast until, I think, February 2016, January, February 2016.
I think you're right.
Like
you're right. Yeah, I do remember that now. We were building a bunch up.
Do you remember what pushed us to start it? We had kind of been dabbling with it. We had done it for a year, but we hadn't published it. I hadn't put it online. I didn't have a website. Do you remember what actually pushed us to do it?
No, I don't actually. I don't remember.
Carla Nappi, who at the time was at the University of British Columbia, now she is at the University of Pittsburgh. She's a historian of, I think, late imperial China. Excellent historian. She does
fantastic,
books, the new books in Asian studies or new books in East Asian studies. I forget which. Great podcast if you're looking for academic-y books. They're all academic-y. She actually came to the UO. She was coming to the UO, University of Oregon, to do some sort of grad student conference that we were hosting in I think March or April of 2016. And I was like, we've been doing this podcast, Rob. We have to put it online to be legit. And then, you know, when we talk to her, we can tell her, hey, we're actually podcasters as well. And so that's what pushed us to do it.
Do you remember? We must have already had it online when we interviewed Stephen Durant, right?
I think so. Yes.
Because that's one of my earliest big memories of the podcast. Is for those who don't know, Stephen Durant, Professor Stephen Durant, who was at the University of Oregon for many, many years.
He's a professor emeritus now, I think.
Yeah. He was and is in some ways the guy for certain periods of Chinese literary and historical studies. So like the Shijing, the Records of the Grand Historian, he's like the guy on that. Anyway, big name in academia, at least in Chinese studies. And we started talking with him and sort of were like, hey, we do this podcast, huh? Would you want to do it sometime? And he's like, yeah, sure. Do you remember? That was still, we didn't even have good recording. No, we had no good recording stuff. We all just sort of clustered around our crappy MacBook speaker microphone thing.
No. I think by that point we had upgraded to do you remember that little USB mic?
Oh, I do.
That we plugged into the side of your computer. I think by that point that was what we were recording.
That was our upgrade. You and I had a beer. Did he drink a beer? I think he may have had tea instead of beer.
I think you're right.
I'm still amazed that he did it. And it's interesting because that experience also, watching him, I was like, that for me is sort of like the model scholar, right? This is an absolutely dead serious scholar, total genius.
I can't emphasize this enough. Stephen Durant is one of the big names in the study of Sima Qian, the Han Dynasty historian. He's also did a translation of the Zhuozhuan, the sort of first historical document that we really have coming out of China. There are some other historical documents that probably claim to be older, but like the Shujing, the Book of Documents, but a lot of those are later, actual later creations. This is really the first work of narrative history. The Zhuozhuan is the first work of narrative history that we have still existent today. And he's doing this translation with like the top people in his field.
And so, yeah, you mentioned top names in the field. That by the way, is Li Waiyi and David Schaberg.
Li Waiyi is at Harvard. David Schaberg is at UCLA. Just like the top folks in their field. Li Waiyi, I actually met her at Stephen Durant's retirement party. And it's just stunning how intellectually gifted she is.
Yeah, I've read a lot of her stuff. Yeah, fantastic scholar. Anyway, all that to say, the guy that was working with them was sitting in my fairly dingy second floor office talking into a not great USB mic with two guys holding beers about literature. I mean, it was just like, why are you here?
Yeah, so I just looked it up. That episode aired in April of 2017. So we had been publishing the podcast for a year. And I just to go back into the historical records, since we love Sima Qian so much, let's get the dates right.
That's it.
We started airing the podcast in April of 2016. So right before Carla Nappi came to the UO. I think we actually put 2 episodes on at the same time just to make us look like we were a real podcast.
Yeah, we don't just have one; we have more than one. I mentioned just a quick last thing about Stephen Durant because I mentioned he's sort of like the model scholar. That's what I mean by model scholar. The guy is at top notch, everything in his field, but he's still enough of just an everyday human being to go, yeah, I'll sit down and do your little podcast with you. Like that was such a generous gesture. I was like, wow, this guy is doing this.
The word you're looking for, Rob, is he's a real mensch.
He's a real mensch. There you go. Thank you. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that was sort of our Aerosmith on Wayne's World moment in early podcasting, but it's interesting thinking about some of those early interviews. I'm trying to think. Oh, I know I'm not going to mention some names because we've had some pretty awful interviews as well. I'm not gonna make anybody angry at this. I'm getting ready to not be a regular contributor. I want my last gesture to be like, and the following people. But you and I have talked about some of those many times where we and they said and did things we're like, ooh, that didn't work at all. One in particular I remember, the person involved was one of the people who in a professional situation tends to halt like that a lot and repeat things like that, and editing that podcast was a nightmare. It took hours to edit out the and. Oh my gosh. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. I think that by the time I got it, you had already done most of the editing work. And so
it was so hard.
Yeah. And do you remember that podcast that we didn't actually end up airing by someone who's...
Oh, yes.
Remain
nameless. Definitely don't want to make that person angry, but it's the only time in history we recorded a podcast and got yelled at.
Yeah, it happens.
It did.
And I actually realized one of the reasons that happened. So you arranged the podcast, and
Right.
I had not been involved in the planning. And I think that because I wasn't involved in the planning, I didn't know all of the negotiations that had happened. And I was just like not aware of the sensitive like nature of it all. And I didn't think anything of it when it happened. But then there was actually a podcast that I negotiated to get an interview for, and that one aired. It was great. But there were a couple of times in the recording of the podcast that we edited out where you said something that was just completely daft and like utterly unacceptable. And it almost sent it spiraling down that same hole. And it was funny because I think that you not being involved in the negotiations with that person is what happened, and the same thing happened on my end when that complete disastrous podcast that we didn't air when we recorded that one. And so I think one of the things I've learned is, there has to be some sort of like it really has to be an effort of partners if you're going to have a podcast like this. When you interview someone, you can't have one partner bring them in and do the negotiations entirely on their own and then just expect the other person to completely show up and mentally be there in the same space that the two of y'all, the interviewee and the other podcaster, where those people are at. It kind of messes with the dynamic. And that dynamic is what our podcast has thrived off of.
Yeah, I agree. But thankfully, we kind of righted the ship. I mean, the last big series we did, which is on Lu Xun, the biggest series we ever did, that one, we had a couple of really good interviews. I mean, all of the people who came on to do interviews were great, but there are just, and it's just a fact, there are just some discussions that click better than others. And we had a couple that I thought, wow, that was great, man. I really enjoyed doing that.
One for the history books.
Yep. So I'm curious. In the course of the podcast, have you discovered any writers or books that you wouldn't maybe have engaged without the podcast that now you're like, that's one of my favorite things in Chinese literature?
So I wouldn't say that he is my favorite writer. He's someone who I respect that you turned me on to. So I've made this clear throughout the podcast. I'm not a big fan of science fiction.
Right.
But Chen Qiufan, I think, can do some pretty interesting stuff. Now, we did his Waist Tide, the novel that we both thought was not quite as good as we... Yeah, I mean, it was not as good as some of his short story writing. It was also his first adventure into writing a novel, right? Like,
right.
Every writer has a kind of arc where their first novel... not that great.
Right.
But as a short story writer and as a stylist, I think he's quite impressive. And the way that he uses science fiction to get around the red lines of political debates that are there in China. And, we're recording this at the end of November after a series of protests have emerged in China. So in terms of the news, those red lines couldn't be more apparent. But Chen Qiufan is able to toe right up to the line and maybe kind of stick his foot out over it, but not touch the ground. And that was what I found incredible about Chen Qiufan, is he's tackling these issues that I thought were no-go issues, but he's doing it in such a way that it gets around the question of can you or can you not publish on this topic.
Yeah, and what I did like about Waist Tide is, you and I both agree, it was not a great novel, but there are, even with the not great aspect of it, there were parts of it where I went, that's really interesting. Like, I wouldn't have thought to put those things together on the page. And they may have been infrequent, and they may have been in the minority. In fact, they were in the minority. But it's still interesting enough to make you go, this guy's got something. So yeah, that's a good mention. I think mine would be, because as of course, as I've made clear throughout the podcast, I'm a modernist. I appreciate the classical tradition, but that's not usually where I go first. I'm almost always going to go first for the modern stuff. That's kind of what I like. But doing the podcast has forced me to read more of the classical tradition. And while I'd heard of Sudongpo before doing the podcast, reading and then translating some of Sudongpo was phenomenal. I had read, of course, Du Fu, Li Bai, a lot of the classic sort of Tang poets, but you and I had talked about this too. Most people don't tend to teach Song poetry.
It kind of gets missed.
Yeah. If you're in a Chinese lit class, it's usually the Tang Dynasty, and I thought Sudongpo was incredible. In fact, I was just thinking before we did this podcast earlier today, I was like, like, if I got handed a humanities class here in France, like we want you to teach, say, just a handful of humanities topics, like what Chinese writers would I want to introduce students to? And Sudongpo would definitely be one of those writers. I don't know if I'd call him my favorite Chinese poet ever, but he's definitely in the top 3.
Who are the top 3?
That's a good question. I said top 3 without actually having a top 3. Don't ever do that on a podcast. Oh, let's see. I would put Sichuan in the top 3. I love Sichuan.
So that's a very contemporary 1980s, still writing today, right?
Yeah, he's still active. So those two, gosh, that's I don't know. Those two for me are obvious. After that, it gets kind of murky. I can think of a lot of poets I like. I mean, an easy one would be like, what about Du Fu? But so my litmus test again is who would I want to introduce students to? I think I could probably present Sichuan in a way that would make it interesting, but maybe if I switch the rubric to what am I just going to sit and read in the way of poetry? Those two are obvious. After that, I'm honestly, it's kind of hard to say. Do you have a top 3? Let's hit the tennis ball back on your side of the court.
Sudongpo, Li Bai, and Tao Yuanming.
Tao Yuanming. That's not a bad reference either. Yeah, Tao Yuanming is a really interesting one too. I'd have a hard time nailing down a clear third. I think my tastes tend a little more towards maybe not even tend more towards, I like a lot of the weird experimental stuff. So, I mean, even Ouyang Jianghe's Phoenix, which I'm the only person I know who really likes, I think it's just utterly fascinating for lots of reasons.
My wife said that podcast that we did in 2016 November was maybe our worst podcast ever.
It's highly possible. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, dear listener, don't present a topic that the other people on your podcasting team actively dislike. Like, I don't want to do this. And you're like, we need to do this. It's awesome. Probably don't go with that idea because it's not going to go well. Everybody's got to be on board.
I did that same thing with like the pornographic story.
Yep, I remember that.
I was like, let's do this. And Rob was like, I'm not comfortable.
Yeah, I was not in favor of doing that one, but
it worked out okay. It was a little awkward. Brandon was on that podcast.
This is why, though. This is why. I don't know if you remember this. You didn't sell it at all. Just not even at all. In the beginning, you were like,
good at selling.
Let's do this pornographic. But I was like, what? No, I'm not going to talk about porn on the podcast. You're like, let's come on, it'll be fun. I was like, no, and it went on for weeks, and you were just like, because it's porn, and I was like, I'm not like it'll goose our ratings. There were lots of things you said.
I said it was going to goose our ratings too, thinking that. Yeah.
Once you put porn in there, everyone's going to be like, ooh, let's listen. Anyway, the way you finally sold it eventually was to be like, oh, this is the text. It was like a pre-Jinping made text. What was the deal?
Yeah. So the particular text that we were looking at was the Jinping Mei, which is one of the great novels of Chinese literature. It's a 100-chapter novel. It's also a pornographic novel. We have done one episode on it, but I think I will probably end up doing a series on it later. It's one of the source texts is this pornographic work, and it's a short story, very weird. It's about Wu Zetian, the Tang Dynasty era empress. I guess she was empress during the Tang Dynasty, but she also sort of founded her own dynasty in the middle of the Tang Dynasty, the Zhou Dynasty. And she takes a lover with a very large penis. And the whole story is about him using that F her into submission. We don't curse on the podcast because we want to maintain our safe rating. But there's no really other way to say it in English. He F's her into a sort of patriarchal submission. And she ends up kind of in the story, not in real history, but she ends up kind of submitting to the man and becomes a dutiful woman.
Confucian woman, yeah.
And it's really a fascinating text.
I'm still not sold on it, but like the Ouyang Jianghe Phoenix one, I think we're all allowed kind of a mulligan where we're like, this is going to be great, and I still like it. I don't care if you don't. So we've been doing it for 7 or 8 years now. So yeah, I'm trying to think if we have any more of those. I think the Nixon in China podcast, that was also my like, I think this is going to be awesome, and you're like, okay, whatever.
But at that point, I was like, look, we all have these things. Maybe this will work out. Maybe it won't. Yeah. But it's just one single podcast, and it's fun to get to see it playing out. I was. You're right. I was very skeptical as to whether or not people would like it or whether or not it fit our podcast MO. But I was totally down for you doing it because you wanted to do it, and I think it was okay. I think it was great. Like we all have these weird interests. As several Ming Dynasty scholars have said, people without obsessions aren't really human. Having an obsession is what makes us human.
And of course, by then, you and I had been doing it long enough, the podcast long enough, that we could make most topics interesting, even if we weren't into it. So a lot of our early mulligans we weren't yet good enough at it to really just kind of take whatever it is and run with it. So you mentioned the Jinping Mei, and you want to do a series on it, which I think you should, and I'd be surprised if you didn't. Do you have any other ideas? Like, what are some other things you're like, I have been dying to do this, and I'm going to freaking do it?
Well, I've got an episode on Mo Yan's Red Sorghum. That's the script is already written, and that'll be coming out probably in a few weeks after we air this podcast. I don't know. Jinping Mei is definitely one. I would like to do some of the other classical Ming Qing novels. So Hong Lo Meng, Dream of the Red Chamber. And we just haven't really had time to tackle those.
Golly. I would say I don't know if I have that as a regret from my time on the podcast, but it's definitely, I'm going to use a nice academic word, it's definitely a lacuna in our podcast.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that. As soon
you could see it coming. Your academic radar was like ding, 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 BS coming. And lacuna is a lack, a hole, something. We have a whole Chinese literature podcast. Never once got into Dream of Red Chambers. But part of the reason is it's like the fictional work in China. And the idea of doing like a couple of one-off podcasts, it doesn't work. Like you have to swing for the fence or just not do it,
I'm going to see when I do that as a series, I'm going to see if I can just do maybe like 5-6 episodes on Dream of the Red Chamber. To be fair, there's already a great podcast on the Dream of the Red Chamber called Rereading the Stone. Definitely check that out if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean I'm glad you brought that up because that's another reason why I didn't jump on it earlier. Is I was like, there's already a really good podcast entirely dedicated to this, or things kind of surrounding it. Like I think whatever we do is going to kind of pale in comparison.
I think it will pale in comparison when I do it. But the thing is that the guys who do the Rereading the Stone podcast are doing something fairly different than what we do. I mean, they're deep diving into like every episode, I think, is like half of a chapter of this 80 to 100 chapter book. I think they're somewhere in the 30s or 40s, if I remember correctly. I don't know if they're going to do the 80 chapter edition or the 120 chapter edition, but either way, they're really getting into the nitty gritty. You and I avoid that because we see ourselves more, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, we see this podcast as an attempt to reach out to the general public and connect them with Chinese literature, which, at least in the English-speaking world, there aren't that many good sources of information on China. Of course, you've got the big podcast, the China History podcast, the Senecas. Those guys are great, but when you look at how many podcasts there are compared to like medieval England versus all of Chinese history, and you compare those, at least in the English language world, obviously it's a totally different beast when you're talking about Chinese language podcasts, but that's kind of irrelevant to what we're trying to do, which is connect folks who speak English, whether or not they're native speakers, if they're Europeans or South Americans, everybody who speaks English wants an entree into the world of Chinese culture, Chinese literature. We have tried to give them that. And I think that that introductory nature of our podcast is one of the reasons why we have succeeded quite a bit, I think.
Yeah. I think people have kind of locked into this is a really good way to understand something about China that's not in the news, but is still pretty important. And these guys are having fun while they do it. So I don't have to, I don't have to spend an hour and a half, bending my brain trying to understand something. I can listen to people having a chat and learn something. So that's been a really effective format. And in fact, it's interesting. I was going to mention way earlier in this episode, but one of the things that I think drove us early on when we were both at the University of Oregon is we were in an environment that if you've ever been to grad school, you'll know what I mean, dear listener. It can feel very stuffy.
Danger zone.
Yeah, very stuffy. Like, unless you're using all the critical theory code words, or unless you're deep into some research project that no one's really going to know very much about, it's like you're not really a scholar or something. And you and I have always had a very good sense of humor and at least the capacity to not take ourselves too seriously. And so it was kind of fun sitting down to do this and thinking, we're going to kind of take a hard left from all of this for a while.
Academia is so insular, so inbred, that it's just, it doesn't end up speaking to the wider public. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with this book is bring the rigor of academia, but none of the rigidity. I think folks are interested in learning more about China. I think your educated suburban reader in Philly or Paris or Buenos Aires is interested in learning more about China, but there just aren't that many people who are writing for them. There are journalists who've covered China. They write stories, but they're very narrow focused and often very kind of contemporary focused. There isn't that much looking at the history, and those who do look at the history do it oftentimes quite shoddily, honestly. There's a lot of really bad books on China that are published by journalists who don't speak Chinese.
It's interesting being on the other side of academia, seeing this. And one of the big problems that humanities disciplines have is that they just have no PR whatsoever. Science is loaded with it. There's so much popular science and popular science podcasts, books, magazines. It goes into films and all of that. Humanities just seems to, possibly with the exception of history. I'll throw history out because there's a ton of history out there. And that's not because stuff like literature is boring. Everyone loves stories. But I think a lot of humanities scholars are their own worst enemy with some of this stuff. And anyway, so this was kind of our thing going, you and I both agree that Chinese literature isn't inaccessible. It's not like if we just gave you a short story by Lu Xun, you wouldn't go, what is, I don't even know what's happening here. Of course you would. You know how to read literature. You'd appreciate it. You just have to have somebody.
It's made inaccessible by scholars who are so deep into theory that they can't communicate to a broader audience.
Right, exactly. And so we thought it would be fun to cut through that, and we've done that for almost 8 years now. So that's a long run. The Beatles only lasted 10.
And in the end,
yeah, you can. We're gonna get sued. We are gonna get sued. We lasted longer than Creedence Clearwater Revival, and I'll still be making and like any group, right? We'll still be appearing on each other's projects. Those bands that quote unquote break up. And then the drummer is on everyone's album for the next 20 years. So it's like, but did you really though?
Tool, Smashing Pumpkins, right?
The Beatles, Ringo Starr played on everyone's music for ever. So
did you want to talk any more about the history of the podcast? Like we kind of covered up to the beginning. Did you have anything else on the beginning of the podcast you wanted to talk about?
No, except that I never thought
in the middle.
The middle of the podcast. Well, the middle, it's always funny. It is like being in a band where each sort of new phase you think, all right, we've made it. This is it. We're really clicking. We're really cranking it out now. We have like 500 people per month that are listening to us. We are killing it,
I remember when we would get like 10 a month.
Yeah, I do too.
And we were like, yes, we broke into double digits.
Double digits, yay! And then it was 1,000, and then we're like, what is happening?
So part of what happened there, Rob, I don't know if you remember this, part of what happened is when you came back from China in 2020, in February, March of 2020, we started airing episodes every week, which I think kind of created a cycle of people had more to listen to, but also they were more kind of into us. That actually was a genius idea. It helped us take off quite a bit.
I think that, but I also think something kind of clicked. It's funny. You can do exactly this thing for years and still not have exactly the right chemistry to really pull it off. And I think sometime in 2020, you and I really, the on-mic chemistry really clicked a lot more and we were really rolling with it. And I've had a couple of people mention that to me. And so I think both of those two things coincided. And it's funny, you ask about the middle of the podcast. We were doing one per month for a long time?
Yeah, one per month.
One per month.
And then in 2018, you went to France. In 2019, you went to China. So there was just no way we could record stuff. I first was introduced to Zoom in 2019, and I think we used it a couple of times while you were in China. But before that, the sort of online recording options were fairly limited, and they were kind of crappy. So what we did was we actually recorded a bunch of episodes in the summer of 2018. You went to France, and I just released them every month. And you just kind of, I think it's fair to say you were kind of checked out from the podcast when you were overseas, right?
Yeah. We tried recording one episode when I was in France, and the audio quality was so hideous.
Gilets Jaunes one.
It was awful.
No. I think we did one, and I remember us talking about the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vest.
Did we air that?
I think we did air it.
Oh, I was thinking for some reason we scrapped it because the audio quality was so bad.
I think it was that bad, but I think we just kind of went with it.
All right. Well, a lot of people still tuned into the podcast, so apparently it wasn't too bad. Yeah, did you have anything from the middle of the podcast? I don't remember a lot that was remarkable where, you just go, wow, that's something that I can't forget.
I would say one of the things, I didn't realize this at the time, but in sort of the nature of, I'm going to use a term that Michael Allen taught me, the mediality of the podcast, the way that it works as a medium that's different from other things and probably similar to Twitter and some of the social medias. It's not so much about the message, it's the media itself. I mean, I'm obviously crimping off of Marshall McLuhan there. The thing about the middle of the podcast, really from 2017 to 2020, that I would say is I don't think we did anything that was stunningly good, and we were just kind of creating this back catalog. At the time, I was wondering, what are we doing with this? But we just kind of kept doing it because we really liked talking about Chinese literature and we loved reaching out to folks. We weren't getting that much of a response, but it turns out it didn't really matter because we were creating this long back catalog that people could listen to. And that's important as a podcast. Oftentimes, I think podcasts get listened to because they have these long back catalogs that people can kind of binge on, and then they get addicted to them. The quality was an issue. The sound quality we had was pretty bad, but as we got better, I think people were more forgiving of us having that growing experience and having a back catalog that sounded like dog poop.
Yeah.
We needed those years of kind of experimentation, just trying things out. Yeah, before we could grow like we did in 2020 and 2021.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, you're probably this way too, but the way I usually engage a podcast or a YouTube channel I like or whatever is I usually listen to the most polished things first. And then once I'm hooked and I go, wow, this is so great, I'll kind of dig back into the old stuff, even when it's kind of shaky and not very good, because it's like I can see the seeds of what would come later because I already know about it. And so it's easier to kind of forgive it and be like, all right, this is not great, but I can still see what they're getting at here. This is pretty cool.
I think that same thing is true of writers too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The more you write, the better you get. I mean, that's just how it is.
No. Sorry. I think that's true of how at least I read writers is I'll read their best stuff.
Oh, I see.
And then I'll go back and be like, this isn't that great, this first novel, but I can see how she goes from here and gets to here.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's definitely that's what I did with Vonnegut, for example. Reading, I think I read Galapagos first, and then Slaughterhouse-Five, and then read a lot of his older short stories and stuff. And I was like, this is not as good, but I can totally see it.
Yeah. one topic I've been meaning to mention is I really have to give a shout out to my wife.
Yes.
I don't think I mentioned this too much in this recording of the podcast over the past couple of years. Sometimes I would allude to it, but my wife was always the first person to listen to an episode. She usually listened to them before they aired and would tell us, that's crap, you need to take that out, or, ooh, that sounded really bad, or your sound is completely off. She is kind of like our fifth Beatle.
She's our quality control person. Yeah, exactly.
She's really our fifth Beatle, our George Martin, if you will. She was the person behind a lot of the making us sound less crappy than we would have naturally. So I really want to give a big shout out to her. Thank you so much for helping make the podcast as good as it is.
Agreed. I have to do the same shout out. Thanks for quality controlling our otherwise unlistenable gibberish. Hopefully not otherwise unlistenable. That may be a little extreme. But anyway, we do have a lot of gibberish. It's just a podcast.
Just a little.
We're nerds, and we're talking about something we're nerds about. There's just going to be a lot of gibberish involved.
Anything else, Rob? Any other things that you want to talk about?
This has been kind of it's been fun, sort of kind of having a little bit of a nostalgia trip here to close out my regular participation in the podcast. And like I said, I'm stepping back from being a regular contributor, but there'll probably come a time, Lee, if you're doing a series on something you and I both always wanted to do, I can certainly jump back in and we can do that. Or, I'm not disappearing forever, but I am no longer going to be a regular contributor. So look out for me in the future, though.
Hopefully we'll have other guests on the podcast too. And I'll be trying to promote the podcast through a variety of other podcasts. Yeah.
And also stay tuned for Lee's book. Give him the title again, yeah. Lee.
China's Backstory. That's provisionally the title. Looking on getting it out to agents and publishers right now. Write me if you're in the publishing industry and would be willing to offer help, even if actually you just want to be a beta reader. I've already had some listeners reach out to me and say, hey, I'd like to take a look at stuff when it's kind of halfway complete. I'd really appreciate having your comments and letting me know how I'm doing and how I can improve.
And I should mention this as well. For those who are interested in such things, my translation will be published. I'm not sure when. The publishers haven't given me a date or anything, but the manuscript is with them now.
When it is published, obviously, we will have you back on the show to promote it. So you, listener of the Chinese Literature Podcast, will be the first to know.
That's it. You can interview me. What? And I'll interview you maybe on the same podcast. That's just insane. Wow. We're going to be famous and rich.
So it's at the publishers right now, right?
Yes. They have it. They're kind of getting their ducks in a row for the upcoming year, and I'm sure they're going to want me to change a bunch of stuff. But, for now, that's where it is. And that'll be, of course, it's just called Notes on Poetry, CI Poetry, from the Human World by Wang Guowei, translated by me. And it won't be super long either. I was really happy with how concise it was. So in other words, you won't be buying something or reading something however you access it that's like a 600-page monumental treatise. It's going to be nice and tight.
I'm just thinking about the translation of the Zuozhuan that Stephen Durant co-did with those other two professors, and it's just so big.
It's big. It's really, you're committing yourself to something. It's a heck of an endeavor. I give him kudos for that. It's a heck of an effort. But yeah, you are definitely committing yourself to that.
Yeah. Committing your wallet as well.
Yes, definitely.
Rob, should we end it there?
That sounds good to me. Let's end it there.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.